Um, Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Koziel. I'm the executive director of the Virginia Housing Alliance, and just want to welcome you all to our legislative wrap up. As best we can tell you where things stand, we still are waiting on a budget, um, but just a few couple housekeeping things. There will be we've got 15 minutes planned at the end of the session. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat, and we will respond to them or work our way through them at the end of the session. Please remember to mute yourself, and I will just turn it over to Isabel McLean, who is our Director of Policy.
Thanks so much. Yeah, as Brian said, my name is Isabel McLean. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Virginia Housing Alliance. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with y'all about some of the housing developments that have occurred throughout the 2024 General Assembly. I'm going to be sharing this presentation with my colleague, Allison Brown, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you here today. I'm Allison Brown, and I'm Policy and Advocacy Associate here at VHA.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Alrighty, I think that's worked. Great. So as I said, I'm excited to share with y'all some of the new things that have been passed through this General Assembly. Firstly, I will start with kind of giving a overview of kind of the context of where we are right now in the legislative process. And then both Allison and I will share about housing-related legislation that was successfully passed during this General Assembly, including an update on housing-related funding levels that are currently on the table right now for ongoing budget negotiations. After this summary, we will highlight a few priority items or honorable mentions, if you will, that did not make it this session, but have been on our priority list that we will continue to be working on, and offer a few opportunities to advocate for affordable housing in the coming months. And then, of course, as Brian said, we will end the time with questions. Oh, I also want to add before I begin that we have, obviously this is going to be recorded. We will share that and make that available on our website afterwards. And we will also be sharing a one-pager resource guide that kind of summarizes the information you're going to hear today. We really want to make sure that this information is as accessible as possible. So feel free to share those with others in your network or anyone else that is curious about housing policy. All right, so on this side, you will see a general timeline of important dates regarding our state legislative process. Technically, the 2024 General Assembly adjourned on March 9th, but the work was far from over. On that day, the General Assembly communicated to the governor all of the bills and the budget that they had passed during this session, giving the governor 30 days to respond and take action on those items. Those actions could include amending, offering amendments to bills, vetoing bills, signing bills so that they become law, or letting bills become law without his signature. So April 8th was the 30-day deadline for the governor this year. And by that day, he'd announced all of his actions. He interestingly set the record for amount of vetoes that a governor has done in Virginia, and also a record for most recommendations for the budget. He included over 220 different recommendations. Last week, legislators returned for what's called the reconvene session on April 17th to respond to the governor's actions, to either, accept or reject amendments, to try to override a veto if that were possible, and hopefully vote on a budget. However, the General Assembly voted to reject all of the over 220 recommendations that the governor offered to the budget. But both the General Assembly and the governor committed to continuing budget negotiations. So they delayed the budget process, but they have committed to seeking a new budget, a new compromise over the next month or so. So the governor has scheduled a special session on May 17th for the General Assembly to return to vote on whatever this compromise budget ends up being. Hopefully, we will have a budget at that point. They do absolutely have to pass a budget by July 1st to avoid any financial issues, because that is the first day of the next fiscal year, fiscal year 2025, which the budget is for. Also, July 1st is the day that any new bills from this legislative session officially become law. So now that you understand the general context of where we are and why we're not able to totally give you a final update on the budget, we're going to dive into some more specifics about the impact of housing or the impact of the session on housing and kind of what we do know for sure right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Allison to get this section started.
Alrighty, everybody. So the first group of bills that we'll cover is related to manufactured home parks. So this first bill was introduced by Delegate Delaney and Senator Hashmi. It essentially strengthens protections and clarifies language within the Manufactured Home Lot Rental Act, which is the section of the Virginia Code related to the rights of manufactured home park residents and owners. So more specifically, this bill adds a limit to late fees that park owners can charge for unpaid rent. It also grants a right of redemption for tenants that are facing eviction. And a right of redemption essentially means that if you're facing eviction for unpaid rent, you have the right to pay all that you owe to stop that eviction ahead of time. Additionally, there were some other tweaks to the language of the MHLRA, including clarifying the allowable reasons for eviction. So next here, we have a bill that was introduced by Delegate Krizik. For some background on this bill, it was introduced as a larger piece of legislation with some provisions to preserve affordability in manufactured home parks and also prevent the displacement of residents. However, this bill was amended during the legislative process and only a small section of it passed. Nonetheless, though, this bill made some really important progress. So turning to what was included in the final version of the bill, it chiefly relates to the relocation expenses that a manufactured home park owner is required to cover for residents that are facing a termination of their lease because the park owner has sold to a buyer who intends to redevelop the park or change its use. So in the past, owners had to cover $3,500 in relocation expenses for parks in Planning District 8 and $2,500 in other areas of Virginia. However, this funding could only be used to physically remove the manufactured home from the park. And as we know, a lot of these homes are not, in fact, mobile. So this bill increases that funding to $5,000 across the board and no longer specifies that these funds can only be used for the removal of the home, but they can also be used to cover a wide range of costs associated with relocating for the resident. So next slide here. So next we have a group of bills related to eviction prevention. The first is really big. It was introduced by Delegate Hope. So currently tenants can request that a dismissed or non-suited eviction case be expunged from their record after a certain period of time. But the burden to initiate that process was on the tenant. And this is problematic because a lot of people didn't know about this option or how to do it. And we know that an eviction on someone's record can have really long-lasting negative impacts on their ability to secure housing in the future. So to address this problem, this bill made the expungement of these cases automatic after a certain period of time, which is a great improvement. Next, we have another bill that was introduced by Delegate Hope. It's related to a tenant's right to due process during an eviction case. It clarifies that in these cases, a landlord has to notify the tenant or the defendant if they intend to increase the amount of money that they're requesting for the eviction and by how much exactly. So this is to ensure that the tenant is always aware of how much they owe exactly. So lastly on here, we have a bill that was introduced by Delegate Coiner and Senator Locke. It actually came out of the Housing Commission, which is a work group of legislators and other appointed stakeholders that meets in the off season to study legislative solutions related to affordable housing. And this bill extends the expiration of the eviction diversion pilot program into next year. It was set to expire this year. So for some background, this pilot was created in 2019, and it's active within the general district courts of 4 localities, including Danville, Hampton, Petersburg, and Richmond, Virginia. There isn't any funding attached, but it's a program that helps low-income tenants in eviction cases get onto a payment plan to help divert from that eviction and pay back the money that's owed. And this is particularly for those folks that are in the situation because of a financial emergency, like an unexpected medical expense or job loss. And this extended time frame will help give legislators time to assess the pilot and determine next steps and necessary reforms. So next here we have tenant protection that was introduced by Delegate Delaney. This bill is related to situations where a victim of domestic violence, sexual abuse, or other forms of sexual assault can terminate their rental agreement early. Under current law, there has to be a family abuse protective order in place or a conviction before the tenant can terminate their lease early without penalty. However, in a lot of cases, these requirements pose way too long a wait for a variety of safety reasons. So this bill expands the right to early lease termination to those who've received a permanent protective order and of course have proper written notice.
All right. So I'm going to share a couple bills related to building code standards. Typically, the building code is not legislated on the state level, but there are certain decisions or things that they can do that relate to it. So this first one, it was introduced by Delegate McQuinn and Senator Bagby, and it specifically allows localities to increase the maximum amount of fees that they can impose against repeat offenders or people who are have repeatedly violated the uniform statewide building code. Specifically those that have 3 or more offenses of the same nature within a 10-year period. So it's essentially giving localities a more tools, a little bit more weight to enforce the building code and try to push back on slumlords and those who are not keeping our buildings habitable and up to code. This next bill is pretty interesting. It was introduced by Delegate McClure and Senator Van Valkenburg. And it's related to, well, basically it sets up a study or an advisory group to look at our uniform statewide building code and make suggestions to our code commission regarding single stair exits in residential buildings. So currently, right now, our code says that any multifamily residential building 3 stories and above has to have 2 exit stairways for safety reasons, etc. However, there's a lot of research out there showing that this may not be necessary for this as strict of a 3-story or higher limitation. There are other cities in Europe and other places in the United States that have built buildings before this was necessarily acquired or have different requirements that show that this may be a burden that prevents us from having more dense housing, and perhaps we could use that extra stairway for more actual units or larger units for families. And so they want to have this group to see if there's a way that we can responsibly change our code to allow for more flexibility here. Their suggestion is to do it to residential buildings under 6 stories as a way to allow for more dense and diverse housing. All right. I'll also share about a bill related to the Community of Opportunity Program tax credits that we have, which are currently administered by DHCD. We've had these for a few years now. Originally, it was passed kind of as a pilot for Richmond and certain metropolitan areas, but has now in the past been extended to all of across the whole state. Essentially, what this program does is it incentivizes landlords to rent to housing choice voucher holders in properties that are in census tracts that are considered areas of opportunity, those that have a 10% or lower poverty rate through tax credits. So currently, the maximum tax credits in this program that they can administer each year is at $250,000. This bill increases that to $500,000 to ensure that, you know, more landlords are able to take advantage of this. A lot of public housing authorities and housing choice voucher administrators are really grateful for this program and use it to try to recruit more landlords to actively pursue housing choice voucher holders. And as a way to ensure that this program is achieving its goals towards creating more housing opportunity and allowing for greater housing choice. Also, this bill does earmark 100,000 of that total 500,000 for landlords in non-metropolitan areas. In the past, this has been primarily used by landlords in metropolitan areas, so they're wanting to try to see how they can make this more accessible to those across Virginia as well. And then lastly, I'm going to share about two bills related to funding for affordable housing. I will clarify that neither of these funds actually include money. These are not budget items, but just related to localities' ability to have these funds and create them. So the first one here was introduced by Senator Carol Foy. And basically it creates a work group, another sort of study bill, to analyze the feasibility and potential ways to administer this, to have a Virginia Residential Development Infrastructure Fund. So essentially this could be used to cover costs related to infrastructure that go along with residential building that can greatly increase the cost and prevent some of these units from being affordable. So it could definitely support the affordable housing development that we so desperately need. This next bill, introduced by Delegate Coyner and Senator Locke, this was also a bill that was endorsed by the Virginia Housing Commission that Allison mentioned earlier. This would enable all localities to establish what are called community revitalization funds. Essentially, these are funds that localities can use to, according to language of the bill, prevent neighborhood deterioration through residential or infrastructure development. Currently, only Richmond has this ability. And I don't know if y'all are familiar. From what I know, in Richmond, this has kind of been used as an affordable housing trust fund in a way. It's different than other trust funds like in Northern Virginia that are set up through affordable dwelling unit ordinances. But it is sort of a flexible fund that localities can use to invest in, more affordable housing. So now all localities across Virginia will be able to do this too. All right. So now I'm going to go into an update on where we are with the budget right now, recognizing that we don't have a final answer. There's still some stuff up in the air, but it's good to know kind of where we are and what is still on the table right now. So we've got this chart here. Essentially, it shows proposed increases to various housing programs or housing funds in the biennium budget that was approved by the General Assembly on March 9th for the FY25 and FY26, which you see here in the first two columns. And then it also includes what the governor recommended in response, some of the changes that he offered to that budget and what sort of remained. Now, as I said earlier, the General Assembly did end up rejecting the governor's recommendations and kind of starting over again from the place of the budget that was passed by the General Assembly. But we're not entirely sure what that means and what still, they are looking for negotiating on. but we can, make some guesses, and we'll definitely keep our ears open for whatever sort of news we can possibly get between now and May 15th. But as you'll see here, the Virginia Housing Trust Fund, in both the final budget from the General Assembly and the governor's recommendations, they included a $12.5 million increase each year, which would bring the total of the Housing Trust Fund over the biennium to $175 million, which is definitely the highest that it's ever been funded. Because the governor did not change that number with his recommendations, we can hope that that is secure and might not necessarily change for whatever they decide in the compromise budget. But again, we don't know for sure, but we are hopeful for that. Also, we included in the final budget was funding for continuum of care lead agencies, specifically funding earmarked for capacity building. So right now, the contributions that our state gives towards homeless assistance and homeless prevention services, that actual amount of money has not increased in the past 10 years. A lot of that funding does come from the federal government. And of course, there was a lot of funding during COVID and things like that. But our specific state contributions to that have not increased in a while. And so we really wanted to add some increase that and change that, but also wanted to provide funding that's a little bit more flexible that can be used for things that a lot of other funding avenues are not, are a little bit more restricted. You might not be able to use that directly for some of the things that you really need to make your organization sustainable and actually provide those services. So that's why this was earmarked for capacity building. It was funded at $675,000 in the final budget from the General Assembly in their conference report, and the governor did not recommend any changes to that as well. There were two new programs that the General Assembly included in their conference report or their final budget that were kind of funded as pilots. So they really only had funding for FY25. But there was hope, kind of the way they set them up is for next year for potentially to come back and continue those programs and try to get funding for FY26. So the first of those was a program called the Homeownership for Low-Wage Families. It's basically setting up a down payment assistance program to enable very low-income families to access homeownership. And this is a more deep subsidy, really to try to reach those who otherwise are really not able to access homeownership, and who are, even with some of the assistance that we currently have, that's still not possible. So this was funded at $5 million, but interestingly, the money that the General Assembly set aside for this was actually unallocated funding from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which, if you're not familiar with that, it is a program that Virginia is a part of with other states that essentially sets up basically requires energy providers to pay for using fossil fuels, non-renewable energy for whatever kind of carbon footprint that they have each year, pay a certain amount of money for that towards this fund that then can be used for things like weatherization, flood prevention, energy efficiency in homes, and things like that, to try to address some of the consequences of using fossil fuels, etc. However, Governor Youngkin has wanted to remove Virginia from this from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and has attempted to do that. It's currently in court. Basically, there's a question of if he has the power to do that as the governor, and so our enrollment in this program is a little bit unclear, and the future is a little bit unpredictable. So all that said, using unallocated RGGI funds for this is a creative solution to try to find money to at least get these programs started. But RGGI funding is a little bit controversial. And so as you can see, the governor recommended not funding these programs in that way. The other one I'll also mention here is the manufactured home revolving loan fund, or kind of an acquisition fund for manufactured homes and manufactured home parks. Essentially, this would be a pilot providing some funding for nonprofits to purchase manufactured home parks, or manufactured home owners to purchase the land on which their home is residing. Again, this was with Reggie funding and just a pilot for FY25, but unfortunately, the governor recommended removing that. But again, we don't know what's on the table, and potentially these are back on the table for this compromise budget. I'm going to pass it off to Allison to go over the remaining things on this chart.
Thanks, Isabel. Next, we're going to turn to the Virginia Eviction Reduction Program. So the conference report included an increase of $150,000 for the VERT program. And it is a pilot that works with local organizations across the state to create coordinated systems to prevent evictions. It's nationally recognized for its success in reducing eviction rates. But unfortunately, this increase in funding was not recommended by the governor. So next, the conference report also included an increase of $3 million for our permanent supportive housing program and $1 million for the state rental assistance program, or SRAP. Both of these programs are administered by DBHDS. The permanent supportive housing program provides rental assistance and coordinates services for adults with serious mental illness, with a priority on those who are exiting institutions of care. SRAP, on the other hand, provides rental assistance for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So both of these programs are incredibly important. They're successful, and they're both related to the Department of Justice's settlement agreement regarding providing more community-based housing opportunities for individuals with disabilities in order to combat over-institutionalization. But unfortunately, the governor also recommended removing the increase to permanent supportive housing and cutting in half the increase to SRAP. These programs need greater investments each year to keep up with rising housing costs and maintain support for existing program participants. So we are continuing to work on increasing funding here as much as possible. And that is because the budget is not yet finalized. So this chart could look totally different in a matter of weeks. So this means that there is still time to advocate for some of these housing priorities to be funded in the budget. We have until May 15th to do so. So now is the time to keep the pressure on negotiators to prioritize housing. So one of the ways you can do this is sending emails to the governor, as well as the budget conferees. And the budget conferees are a group of legislators that were selected by each chamber to negotiate the budget on their behalf. We actually have a resource that we can share that compiles the contact information for all the budget conferees. And we encourage everybody to take action here, but especially if you're a constituent of one of the conferees, because that would be super impactful. So you can share information and share your stories about these programs. You can also sign up for our newsletter to receive monthly updates on housing news and policy developments. You can also sign up for action alerts from us to learn about opportunities to get involved and take action.
I was adding those links to the chat as well.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to mention, as I said earlier, some bills that did not make it out the session, but were priorities of VHA and things that we are going to continue to work on, and are kind of honorable mentions because we made quite a lot of progress on them. You know, in general, this General Assembly was not as successful for housing policy as we would have wanted, but we still made significant progress. We still had several wins, as you can see from some of the things that we've recently shared, but also we've built quite a lot of momentum for housing and built more of a presence at the General Assembly, really trying to put pressure on legislators to treat housing as a top priority. All right. So, um, if you are following along with our newsletter and our calls to action, you may be familiar with some of these bills. But our two top priorities this year that VHA led efforts on throughout the session were these two bills here. The first of which was introduced by Delegate Bennett Parker, who was an excellent patron and really fought for this bill. It's related to the preservation of affordable housing. So essentially what it would have done if it passed would be to allow localities, if they wanted to, it's just enabling them to have this authority to establish right of first refusal during the sale of multifamily publicly subsidized properties that are at risk of expiring affordability. So when our affordable housing is being sold and it's within 2 years of the affordability restrictions expiring. So just giving them a tool to step in to try to protect what affordable housing we do have, which is important if we're going to make any sort of progress towards meeting our serious statewide need for affordable housing. This bill did pass out of both chambers in the General Assembly, which was really exciting. This was the first year that it was introduced, but it made significant progress. And we even had a few, it was also bipartisan. We had a few Republicans in the House vote for it as well. But unfortunately, it was vetoed by the governor. But again, as I said, we made so much progress on this, especially in the first year. So we're really happy with where we are with that, and are definitely going to continue working on this and continue having conversations around the preservation of affordable housing, because we believe that Virginia needs more tools in order to protect this important housing. The next priority here is a bill that was introduced by Delegate Coiner, and it's related to property tax assessments of affordable properties. So we've been seeing this problem over the past couple years and before. I'm hearing from lots of affordable housing providers that they are receiving property tax assessments that are inaccurate, that aren't accurately considering and incorporating the fact that these properties have limited income, that you can't compare an affordable housing property to a market rate property, even if they're very similar, because the affordable property, it's going to be making less income due to the restricted rents. And so this has been happening often, and these affordable housing providers are receiving higher tax bills because it's based on assessments that aren't accurately considering their limited income. And so we had a bill this session to try to remedy that, try to make it clear that it was not an option, that tax assessors have to use the income approach, which is a specific method endorsed by professional appraisal standards, but that they had to use that for the assessment of affordable properties. This definitely needs some more work, and we're definitely going to continue pursuing this. It was continued to 2025 and sent to the Virginia Housing Commission to be studied in the off season. So we are gearing up to try to make some progress in the affordable housing work group that it was sent to at the Housing Commission, which is actually chaired by Delegate Coiner, the patron of this bill. So there's a lot of conversations that need to be had and continuing work to try to resolve some concerns and find a way to ensure that affordable housing properties are assessed correctly. I've noticed that I think I hear some sounds. If you are not muted, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Allison to share about the rest of our agenda.
All righty, so first on the top of the list is a piece of legislation related to inclusionary zoning programs introduced by Senator Mick Pike. This bill would have enabled all localities to establish fully effective and flexible inclusionary zoning programs. It passed out of both chambers, and we made significant progress working with stakeholders to resolve some concerns that they had. So while it was eventually vetoed by the governor, unfortunately, we'll continue to work in the off season on this one. Next, we have 2 budget items to share about. The first is the 5,000 Families Pilot Program. VHA has been working for several years to try to set up a pilot for a state rental assistance program to help supplement the federal program. The 5,000 Families program would provide monthly rental assistance to 5,000 low-income families with school-aged children. We decided to target this group to highlight how promoting housing stability is really an education intervention and a healthcare intervention, because access to stable housing has far-reaching impacts in many different ways on the futures of our young people, both in the short and the long term. Next here, we have the Zoning for Housing Production Fund introduced by Delegate Carr. It was set up to provide incentives to localities to adopt zoning policies that encourage the development of affordable housing, like passing an affordable dwelling unit ordinance or reducing exclusionary zoning.
All right, so that is most of the overview that we're going to share with you all. I did want to recognize that this is not an exhaustive list. There were quite a lot of bills introduced related to housing this session, which is also a really good sign for us housing advocates. And if you are curious about any that we did not mention today, I recommend you can check out on our website. We have a legislative tracker that includes the vast majority of those bills, and there's some that we did not mention today, and you could kind of see that information about where they are right now, their current status, and kind of see that all in one place. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, going to share a one-pager kind of summary of what we talked about today, so that it's in kind of an accessible form that can easily be shared and referred to. So I'm going to put a link to that in the chat as well. Hold on one second as I get that. Yep, here we go. And I do see that someone's already asked. We are also can share the slideshow as well afterwards with attendees. And we'll also be sending out the recording of this too. So please share with anybody who is curious. We just really want to make sure that anyone who wants to know about this can access that information. Oh yeah, so here is the information about the one pager. That is all that we have for you all right now. We'd love to open it up for questions. Please feel free to ask, anything about bills you haven't seen up here. We'd love to dive into that some more, but we didn't have, 4 hours today to go over everything. But if there's something on your mind that you're wanting to talk about, we'd love to. So please use the chat. Let's see if we have any questions so far.
Yeah, looking at the chat, I see a couple questions already. So there's a question here that asks about HB 993 and SB 422, which related to the Virginia Residential Landlord Tenant Act and prohibited provisions, fees for maintenance. It was not signed by the governor. But the governor has an action deadline of May 17th, and they're just wondering whether we've been tracking this.
Yes, definitely. I'm familiar with this bill. We have been tracking it. As far as I'm aware, we were not one of the ones leading advocacy around this, but definitely supported this bill. As far as I'm aware, where it's at right now is that the governor offered amendments to it that did take out pretty important parts of this bill. So what it did originally was kind of very clarify that housing providers and landlords could not charge extra fees for maintenance or other kind of junk fees on top of this, that needs to be covered under the rent. As part of renting is that the landlord's responsibility is to cover maintenance, and so there shouldn't be anything additional. And there was also a provision about not charging fees to pay your rent if there's no other alternative. So for example, if the only way that you can pay rent is through kind of a credit card situation where there's credit card fees or some sort of additional cost to that you have to pay, basically this bill says that that's not allowed unless there's other free alternatives, like if you're also able to pay by check or Venmo or some sort of platform as well, that can't be the only option. As far as I know, that the governor recommended removing pretty much everything that related to the fees about maintenance. But he did leave in the section about the fees for payment. He did kind of lessen it, lessen the strength of the language there. So I saw that on April 17th, the General Assembly voted to reject those amendments. So essentially, it looks like the patrons decided that passing it, even with the governor's amendments, that they did not want to do that. They want to try again to get their full intent. Usually when that happens, that means that the governor is going to veto it because he amended it for a reason, and that would be the way that he would let it pass. However, he does have, again, another 30 days to respond to the ways that the legislators responded to his actions. So when they reject the amendments, he has, I believe, until May 17th, or I can't remember the exact deadline, to respond to that, which will likely be a veto. So that's usually what happens when they reject amendments.
Awesome. So next here, I see a question about what was the governor's rationale for the veto of the inclusionary zoning bill, HB 597?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. The rationale that he included with his veto basically said that this bill was not necessary because, localities already have the ability to establish, inclusionary zoning programs or affordable dwelling unit ordinances, and that they already should be doing, whatever they can to, plan for and zone for affordable housing, which is true in some sense, but not really. So essentially what this bill would have done is allow all localities to have the full freedom to choose how to implement an inclusionary zoning program. Currently, all of them are technically allowed to have some form of this program, but if they, except for 7 localities that are in Northern Virginia and Charlottesville, everyone else has to follow very strict restrictions, and kind of like it's very overly prescriptive for exactly what the program can do, how much of an incentive you can offer for the development of affordable housing, and how much, like even getting down to percentage of density bonuses, et cetera. And it restricts localities from making these programs mandatory. And so a lot of localities find that it's hard to take advantage of this when it is so overprescribed that it may not be as effective. They're not able to tailor it to the needs of their jurisdiction. And so a lot of other localities want to have the full flexibility and authority that the 7 do, and they're able to make it mandatory and kind of design these more flexibly. And so that's what this bill would have done. So technically the governor, correct that everyone can do inclusionary zoning programs, but it's very limited how they can. And so the whole point of this bill was to try to open that up.
Gotcha. I see another question here. Just wondering whether we'll do another housing wrap up before July 1 following the special session.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we are considering that. I would love to, especially to give kind of a more deeper dive into the budget after we've heard, whatever compromise they find, and hopefully they find it before July 1st. So, I mean, at the very least, we will be issuing updates on our website and updating this one-pager summary to include that information. But I would like us to also host another kind of update webinar. And also if it turns out that a lot of people wanted to participate today and we're not able to make it, we'd love to also host this again too. As I said earlier, we just really want to make sure that this information is as accessible as possible. So yeah, does anyone else have any other questions?
I'm not seeing any additional ones in the chat.
Okay, well, I can kind of go into a little bit more detail about some of the advocacy opportunities that we have right now, even though the session has technically adjourned. So as we mentioned earlier, we definitely have more time to continue advocating for the budget as we shared. But also there are a lot of opportunities to get involved in these off-season conversations about housing. So several bills were sent to the Virginia Housing Commission this year, which, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of this government body set up to take bills that, we're not able to discuss in detail in our very short session. Essentially, it's kind of their job to try to figure this out in between so that, we can still have deeper conversations, even though we only have a very, very short session. The way that it is set up, if you're not familiar, is that they kind of meet as a full commission, but then they also divide into different work groups based on topics. These meetings, when they meet, are public and open to everyone if you would like to attend. They're also streamed online. There is a opportunity for public testimony in each meeting, but that testimony is only in person. They don't have an option for virtual testimony. Essentially, at these meetings, they're going to be discussing each of these bills. I will say that a lot of work happens outside of those public meetings. It is, a government body that has they've got a really long to-do list. And so there's kind of a lot they could do, but not as much time. And so historically in the past, the Housing Commission has maybe endorsed a couple bills each year, but I don't believe that, I think it would be pretty difficult for them to figure out solutions for all of the bills that were sent to them. I can put in the chat a link to the, actually, Allison, could you do that? A link to the Housing Commission website and a link to the list of bills that they're going to be considering. So as I mentioned earlier, they'll be considering our tax assessment bill. That'll be sent to the Affordable Housing Work Group. There's also some other bills that may have been on your radar. One specifically about, it's called the Faith in Housing Act. Basically a bill that would have allowed faith-based institutions and religious organizations to build affordable housing on land that they own by rights without having to go through a special permitting process, et cetera, as long as what they were building was affordable and open to everyone. That was a really interesting conversation, and we're already starting to discuss that for the Housing Commission this summer. In addition, this is now the second year that a bill was introduced to do this, but related to accessory dwelling units, which are kind of like granny flats, garage apartments, basically kind of a smaller living unit that can be built on a single family home, like kind of residence. Often these are used for to help people age in place, to provide kind of another affordable housing opportunity, to rent out or provide income for whoever owns that home. And right now, it kind of depends on which locality you're in, but usually you have to go through a process to get a permit to do that, etc. And it can be kind of lengthy and expensive in a prohibitive way that prevents people from using this. And so there's a bill introduced to basically say that across Virginia, folks can build ADUs by right. It was a lot more complicated than that, in that there were a lot of provisions kind of allowing for localities to ensure that this doesn't, for example, put too much pressure on the infrastructure, that there's enough infrastructure for these things to be built, that they can potentially deny someone building that if that's a problem, etc. I will say that this was a little controversial. There's a lot of opposition from localities. I mean, essentially, we're a Dillon rule state, which means that localities, the only authority that they have has to be explicitly given to them by the state. So they can't do anything unless the state says they can do it. So any sort of infringement on their choice, their authority or their power to make these sort of decisions is pretty tough, because they already have to fight so hard for that authority. So that was kind of an element of this, that this was kind of taking away some of their authority to restrict ADUs. But there was considerable progress made on this bill. There were several different versions of it, amendments, a lot of conversations that resolved several concerns that people had about it. But unfortunately, there still were several remaining concerns. But, hopeful that with the amount of progress that we made during this session and the amount of like hard conversations that were fit into that very short session, I think a lot of people are excited about continuing that in the Housing Commission as well. So those are just a couple that I thought I'd highlight that are sent to the Housing Commission that some folks might be interested in. And especially if you are a affordable housing provider and have any sort of experience with inaccurate property tax assessments, please reach out to us because we're trying to gather more information about the impact of this and would love more folks at the table to help us find a solution to address this next session. The last thing I will add here, unless there's more questions that have come up while I'm talking, but the last thing I'll add here is that the list of priorities that we kind of had at the end there are definitely things that we're going to continue working on next year. And, hoping that we can gather more support to maybe change the path and prevent another veto for some of these bills or help them pass out. But in addition to these, as well as the 5,000 families and continuing kind of funding for affordable housing, we also will be advocating around our state housing tax credit. Right now, it's set to kind of expire or sunset at the end of next year. So this General Assembly is the time to come back and extend that and kind of look at the program. So that is kind of a new thing that'll come to the table for next year. But a lot of what you've heard about this session that didn't quite make it out or got vetoed or amended kind of down to just scraps. I'm hoping we'll come back again next year. And even if, we're still working with the same governor, that there's still time to make progress, to have more conversations and keep these issues top of mind. Are there any more? I think I saw a couple of questions. Someone asked, can you alert us about Housing Commission work group meetings? Yes, we definitely can. If you look on the website, you can see they have a meeting schedule already up there for at least the first work group meetings and kind of planned out every time the full commission meets. The one about accessory dwelling unit ordinances is scheduled for May 20th. And that is a work group just about that issue because there's a lot to figure out for that. I said that right, the right ADU. Sorry, just checking. They're confusing because accessory dwelling unit ordinances, and then there's also affordable dwelling unit ordinances. So, but that is the one about accessory dwelling units. And so the affordable working group that will look into the faith and housing bill, our tax assessment bill, and several others is meeting on June 5th. And then also the kind of local land use and community interest or common interest communities, that sort of work group also meets on June 5th. So that's kind of where we are right now. But we can definitely send out information in our newsletters or send out kind of a policy alert or something to let y'all know again when those come, or send or let you know when others are scheduled.
I see one question in the chat here asking, what are some concerns localities have regarding ADUs other than infringement of authority?
There are quite a few. Trying to remember off the top of my head. I know there were concerns about wanting to make sure, as I said earlier, that adding these units that there's actually adequate infrastructure. There's adequate like sewer and water for additional units. That if that's not the case, that the locality can say don't build an accessory dwelling unit that is going to be costly, or figuring out a way to make that happen. Essentially what this bill would do is it basically just requires localities to create an ADU ordinance kind of that allows this by right, but also there's some flexibility for them to kind of determine if you still have to like pay a fee for it, when, like I said, the infrastructure question, there's also questions about issues with size of the accessory dwelling units. So originally the bill was trying to make it as flexible as possible, that you couldn't, restrict ADUs by make sure they're really small, but making it flexible so that people do really have choice about what they want to build on their own property. But there was some concern about the maximum square footage for this, and sort of like issues about setback and making sure that it still, fits in with the other zoning requirements in that area. So I know that was a concern. But there were several more. And I think that, the patrons and those working on this bill were able to kind of try to pick out each of these concerns and try to find a solution to each of them, but they're just kept coming more and more. And so I think in general, it was good that they resolved so many of those concerns, but there's still more and kind of this larger issue of how can we get localities on board where they still feel like they have some sort of control over that. Yeah. Well, it looks like we are close to 1 o'clock. I really appreciate you all coming today. If you have more questions or want to talk about any of the things we touched on today, please reach out to us. My email, I'll put here in the chat really quickly. It's virginiahousingalliance.org. Please reach out. Would love to chat with you all. And again, would love to have y'all come to Housing Commission meetings, continue to put pressure on about the budget, and we'll send out the recording and other resources. So thank you so much.